This top 100 evil overlord list is pretty hilarious.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Jordan.
And before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia, where if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us today. We have Eliot back with us, and it looks like Eliot is going to be a regular cast member from here on out, which I'm very happy to have him joining us.
I begged my way in. I'm not proud, but I'm not ashamed either.
And today, our topic is we are going to be talking about villains, how to make an awesome RPG villain, how to make sure that they survive long enough to actually be a fun foe for the player characters to go up against. Because I don't know about you all, but my experience is that unless you have done something extraordinary for the villain, the player characters will attempt to kill them the first chance that they get.
Of course. If you expect anything else, then you're going to get a rude awakening.
Eliot, I was not there for that notorious Darth Vader story from back in the day, but I heard it 1,000 times. Were you there?
Yeah, I was playing in that game.
Why don't you go ahead and tell that?
Yeah, I remember our perma DM at the time had been talking up this Star Wars game that I think a new edition of Star Wars had just come out, and he was interested in playing a game in it. So he gathered together whoever was around at the time, and there was one particularly chaotic individual we used to play with, and it was sitting in the game, and he had been using this bowcaster. It was kind of funny. It was just like in the new Star Wars movies. You know, the bowcaster in that particular game he was playing a Wookiee, and the bowcaster was really strong, and he just kept going, wow, this is really great. This is really great. And we had a homebrew rule basically that if you rolled 3 crits in a row, no matter who you're attacking dies. So, in the very first session, or maybe the second session, the DM, unloads the big bad, being obviously Darth Vader, and wants to give us a taste of what's to come. And so he just puts the ultimate bad guy right there in our game. And without hesitation, he shoots him, without any sort of dialogue or encounter. It was one of those things where he's walking down the ramp from his starship, and we can see him, and so he, just fires one off, and then the DM's of course, yeah, roll, and he rolls a 20, which obviously upset our DM, but still, I mean, he had plenty of hit points. Rolled another 20, and of course the party then presses him really hard. Remember, one more 20, right? So the DM, a little sweaty now, just, okay, go ahead, here's your next one. And he rolled another 20. And so everybody at the table just blows up in laughter. The DM's face gets as red as I've ever seen anybody's. Just, he just closes his book, grabs his notes, and says, okay, game over. And never played again. And that's how you kill Darth Vader.
Well, in the player's defense there, it's not like in the original Star Wars trilogy, Han, upon seeing Darth Vader in The Empire Strikes Back, didn't draw his blaster and fire at Darth Vader before literally anyone else could react.
Immediately.
Well, I mean, and the movie even gives you an out. I don't know why maybe because he wanted to honor the player's 20, I suppose. But
yeah, that house rule.
Yeah. It was a lesson learned by everyone at the table who ever went on to run a game after that. That's for sure.
So what's the moral of the story there? Give yourself a mechanical out?
I think the moral of the story is don't put anything in front of the player characters that you don't want to die right then and there.
Yeah, I mean, and that's always been, I think that's one of the difficult things about generating a villain is you want the villain to be ever present. If the players can't develop a real relationship with the bad guy, then it's almost as if they're just chasing an end boss that's locked away in some level 20 cave that eventually you're going to go to. And,
Mm-hmm.
Me personally, I feel like the players should really know what they're fighting for, and I don't like just kind of hiding away my villains. But if you don't, you have that happen. And in our recent game, I think we talked about it a lot the last time around. I'm running Strahd, and Strahd's meant to be a present villain, and that was my first concern. So you have some options there, though. If you what would you normally do, Clayton, if you have that situation where you want the players to really know a bad guy, but you honestly have to accept the possibility they'll just go up and attack them?
Well, I mean, it wasn't that exact same scenario that you described with Darth Vader, but I've had very, very similar things happen. I had a Savage Worlds game where the player characters in the first round of combat against this big bad boss rolled like they managed to Savage Worlds had exploding dice mechanic, and they ended up dealing 40 damage to an enemy. And in Savage Worlds, most of the time you only need to roll like around 15 to 20 in order to kill an enemy, to kill them outright from having taken no damage to being completely dead. So I learned relatively early on that if there is a mechanic that allows the player characters to just one-shot somebody, it is going to happen, and it is going to happen against the main villain. So because of that, if I'm going to have the player characters encounter a major villain and then hopefully have the major villain show up later, I try to put some sort of contrivance on the situation to where the player characters just aren't going to be able to do that. This might be that the player characters are invited to some sort of situation where there is a mediator there, and it is like a negotiation type situation where everybody agrees that there's not going to be any weapons or anything like that at the negotiating table, and that any act of aggression at this meeting results in whatever third party is facilitating the mediation, they are going to suddenly be against the player characters. So I try to find a way to stack the odds against the player characters wanting to attack the big bad for whatever reason I can come up with.
Listening to you say that reminded me of a scene. I think that it would be a really good example of ways that you can inject your big bad into a story that gives the players a whole lot of reasons not to just do that. As I immediately thought of Indiana Jones. I think it was Last Crusade, the one where he's with Sean Connery,
Mm-hmm.
and they're gallivanting through Germany, and next thing you know, they're at a Nazi rally, and Indy has a face-to-face meeting with Hitler, and in that situation, obviously the movies didn't go to that scope, but why didn't Indy just shoot Hitler when he had the chance? Well, because he was at a rally. He was surrounded by all of his guards. At some point the players probably should be aware that, hey, I could just pull out my gun or I could attack the bad guy right here in the middle of this giant rally, but it's obviously going to be a TPK or whatever. At some point the players have to value the game, right? I think if the players really enjoy your game, and maybe you're not putting them in the first session, but you're playing 4 or 5 sessions, and a similarly obvious, this is not a good idea moment happens, they'll value your game enough to where they'll actually think about what would be a good thing to do, but that's not always going to be the case.
Yeah, that's what I did when I ran a Star Wars game briefly a couple years ago with you, Clayton, and I was thinking very much on that encounter that you talked about, Eliot. But I wanted to have Vader show up like right at the beginning. He was gonna hire a bunch of bounty hunters to go hunt down a Jedi. And I thought, man, like there's a really good chance that somebody's just going to try to jump Vader. And I really got to know the stats from the book to make sure I knew, like, all right, Vader's been Vader a long time. He knows what all of his options are, and he's not going to put himself in some stupid situation. So I kind of played it out in my head a couple times, like, what would it be like if someone tries to attack? What's Vader's moves going to be? And the setting was like a conference room on the bridge of a Super Star Destroyer. So even if they manage to take Vader out somehow and his guards, there's thousands and thousands of stormtroopers between them and their ship, you know, making it very clear as the players, you know, walk through to their meeting, like, you're not going to make it out of here if you make a fool of yourself. So it actually went off, you know, without a hitch. Nobody decided to get crazy. But yeah, you have to assume that there's some kind of self-preservation and they're not just going on some kind of like kamikaze run.
And here's another way to kind of flip this analogy, you know, this situation, I suppose. Let's just think about what we're doing as a DM. You know, we're putting a potentially lethal encounter in front of our players. But, you know, thinking back to that DM who obviously had an epically bad set of rolls go against him, I would love to know what the statistical probability of 320s in a row are. I've probably not seen it happen since then.
1 in 8,000.
So that was just a historically bad moment. But imagine in a different world where, you know, that DM obviously simmered down a little bit. How interesting would that game have been going forward if the DM took it as an opportunity and said, okay, well, power hates a vacuum. What happens now? Darth Vader's dead. What happens now? And perhaps a really great story opportunity was missed by him not playing out that game, and it being, now you have to live through the consequences of your actions and have some really interesting things happen.
Do you remember what was the context, like, physically of this happening? Were they, like, you know, on board the Death Star or something like that? Or did the players have a quick getaway after that? Like, what else was in play at that moment?
Yeah, we, you know, it was really it was one of those one-off moments. I think, if I remember correctly, we had just confronted some stormtroopers or Imperial guards or whatever, and we had just defeated them. So we were already simmered, you know, we were already on high confidence. And we were making our escape. So we had already escaped it. And so really introducing Vader as the bad guy was really just a little bit of foreshadowing, I think. It was just like the ship lands, and as we're gallivanting away, having just escaped, we notice that here comes Darth Vader, who has just arrived, and the idea is, holy crap, guys, get out of here now. You're barely, you know, luckily you just got away before Vader showed up, kind of like on Hoth, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we flipped the script. So, it was really, you know, there was no, I mean, what was the worst that could happen? We just miss. We weren't even having a dialogue with Vader. He was more just a piece of the background that went tragically bad.
Well, there's a reason why the parting shot is such a cliche that it goes back to the ancient Romans.
Going back to what you were saying, though, Clayton, is that, you know, D&D in any 3rd and 5th edition game, I feel like this is less of a problem. The problem being that if the players, say you put just a terribly high CR bad guy in front of the players right off the bat, and they do decide to go, there is no, you know, that's a homebrew 20-20-20 rule. So throwing that out there, in reality, if I say you guys, if a party of 5th level characters encounters a 15th CR bad guy, there really shouldn't be any way that they could ever possibly beat that character. So really what you're risking isn't so much your villain dying, it's just you're risking your players killing themselves by trying to crash themselves onto into an unbeatable foe.
I kind of disagree. I mean, I guess it's just the style of game that I prefer, but, like, you know, I like the gritty realism kind of games, and I've always hated the idea that, there's some hero or villain that's so strong that it's impossible for someone to get lucky and take him down. Like, it might be really unlikely, but, ultimately you're still dealing with ostensibly a human being of some sort. And, under all the skill and armor and, whatever else you want to give them, they're a fragile person. And it's not that hard to kill a person. So I like the idea. I think, like, thinking about it from like a narrative situation with that Vader thing, like, this is part of the problem, of the game mechanic providing the player with more information than the character would actually have. Like, thinking about it, if I was actually doing that and I just took a shot at somebody from a distance, I would see them maybe collapse, but excuse me. But I don't know that they've died, and if this was like a dramatic moment in a movie, I could see, somebody taking a shot at the villain, they fall off a cliff or whatever, but you don't have any mechanical understanding that, oh, well, obviously I just crit 3 times in a row, so that guy's definitely dead. You don't have a health bar over their head that goes to 0. So I don't know. I've thought a lot about, like, in what circumstances would it be cool for a player to declare their action and then the DM rolling the results for them, instead of, having this like meta knowledge that sort of spoils, some potential story avenues or, tension or whatever. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. That's kind of why I brought it up in the first place, is I know that you guys have a lot more experience playing games that are typically a lot more lethal. I typically stay in the main line D&D, hit points, those kinds of things. So on the D&D side, like I said, I worry more about the players. But when you're playing a more lethal game, and there's a real good chance that no matter what a character's experiences, backgrounds, power level is, that a PC on a good day is going to kill them. What do you do then? How do you allow your players to have a relationship, accepting the fact that they're, they could take out your bad guy if they chose to?
Well, in those kinds of games, my experience is that, because the player has had to remain so constantly aware of their character's fragility and has experienced so much anxiety keeping that character alive up to that point, and had so many near misses and, getting out by the skin of their teeth, that they play much more cautiously than you do if you're a D&D character that's just running around throwing your big hero dick at whatever threat you can find. It's just a completely different mindset, and you get much more into like a, survival horror mode than like, high fantasy have at thee sort of mindset. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and those types of games generally don't have basically the historical or the pop culture baggage that these other characters have. Like, put player characters in any situation, in any system where they have the option of killing Hitler, and yes, every single time the player characters will do it. Damn the consequences. It doesn't matter how likely their character is to get killed afterward. They are going to take that opportunity to try to kill Hitler. And I feel like Darth Vader is kind of on that same level, where there is so much meta knowledge known about that character that the player characters are always going to take that shot regardless of what the consequences are. But in a more grounded or more gritty, more lethal game, you're generally not going to have those types of antagonists that the player characters come against. And Jordan, you're right that you've got your character's history of all of the things you've done to try to save your own skin, and you're faced with this opportunity to potentially kill this bad guy. But in these types of games, you you don't have that background for these characters. Usually it's a character that exists just in this game. And so you don't have this greater context for having an imperative to risk literally everything in order to take out this enemy.
You know, I think this is a good time to ask a question that just dawned on me. When we say villain, what do we mean? You know, obviously every story's got conflict, and that conflict plays itself out like in a rivalry between your NPCs and your players. But, you know, there really are, once you get past that, that covers, and a villain really covers the spectrum between, if you're playing in a lot of games, and I'm guilty of this myself, is I usually have some overarching, big, huge bad guy who is, you know, puppet master of the game throughout its entirety. But then, you know, you have your basic villains and adversaries who really in the game, I find those are the adversaries that the players really develop relationships with. And I mean, those are really, I've found that in the games, I may have this big bad in the back of my head that I feel is the focal point of the game. But the players themselves actually find a lot more satisfaction. I know I am as a player whenever there's a ground level henchman who is close to us in ability and strength, and you'll have replay encounters with them, and the DM's not so attached to them that they can't die. And when you finally do overcome that bad guy, those are the ones you, as a player and as a DM looking back on it in my games, I feel like the players have had a much more fun relationship with just the henchmen.
Yeah, I love using henchmen and underlings as extensions of the big bad of the campaign, whether the big bad is an organization or whether it is a singular entity. Using those proxies allows you to get that investment in the player characters, and whenever that proxy does get killed, you do get that high of, yes, we defeated this enemy. And I feel like it really goes a long way for building up the main enemy in the long run, and gives your player characters the opportunity to have these smaller victories along the way.
And if it's one of those games that, like, you know, explores a little bit more like nuance in like power relationships, you know, and things like that, I don't see why you necessarily have to have like one big bad pulling the strings behind everything. You know, like Game of Thrones, for example, there's multiple candidates for what constitutes the big bad, and, you know, various people kind of rise and fall through that, and there's lots of ambiguous players in there. There's lots of, like, you know, seeming allies that turn out to be, you know, pretty nefarious actors themselves. And I mean, I think it's interesting when you have things like you know, Senator Palpatine starts out seeming to be, you know, an ally, and it's the smart villain does not reveal themselves, you know, as such right away. Like, that's a very, you know, comic booky kind of way of dealing with stuff like this. Like, you could make your villain known, but not present them as such, and it'd be, you know, a much more interesting story for it, I think.
You know, Apocalyptia, there was once upon a time, you had sent me an early draft, or maybe one of the first completed versions, and I printed it out and I went through it, and I really loved it. And at the time, I didn't have any players, but I was like, okay, I'm going to make a game and I'm going to play this. And I was just looking over the rules, and I was thinking to myself, how could I build this game? What do I want to do with it? And I really enjoyed your the random encounters. It's been a minute, so I might butcher it, so correct me if I do. But what I really liked was that you had built a system where the environment itself was very hostile. And so I created this map of, like, I think a destroyed, broken down Chicago. And I built this vague storyline where a group of players needed to go from a rural area into an urban area to get some device for their colony that they had set up. I don't know. They needed a generator, and they knew it, and they had to travel. And the entire game was going to be them going in and out of this map of hostile terrains. And so the goal was that I was just going to harass the players the whole time, using as they went through more and less, and they wouldn't know at the time. So I basically created this weird little map that was very hostile. And I don't know. I guess I'm beating around the bush about an idea. Is what do you guys think about the world itself being the bad guy? I think the Neverending Story comes to mind. What was the name of the
Nothing?
The Nothing, yeah. I mean, really, the Nothing was just that. It was nothing. There was no bad guy. I mean, I guess the wolf, but that was more of a henchman. That would be a really fun game to play. Very simple, but, I mean, that movie, to me, is has the most evil villain of all, because it doesn't even have form.
I think that would lend to much more believable characters and motives that you're in opposition to. I mean, that's essentially what we're in now. The universe is hostile to existence, and every day is a struggle. And sometimes, there's conflict over the limited resources available. And so, what's a villain? Like somebody, I want to conquer the world, whatever. That's cartoonish. To have whether it be political motives or just pure survival. There's all kinds of different reasons why intelligent organisms get at each other's throats over things, and ultimately it's because of the context of the struggle to continue to exist and how we react to that. So yeah, I it's one of the problems that I have with D&D as presented. Within the magic system, there's a way to make a post-scarcity utopia that no one's ever gonna have to worry about anything ever again. So yeah, I like where you're going with this.
Yeah, but the media that our games emulate, there is an opposition force. There's usually a singular person or singular entity who is the opposition, who is doing something that the player characters need to stop. I mean, that doesn't mean that every game has to be that, but the majority of games, I feel like the players do kind of expect to have somebody that they can point to or point at and basically be the focus of their heroics, who they are fighting against.
Yeah, personally, I whenever I like to write my own content, and I will say a lot of what we're talking about now, having a module base to go off of has been very helpful for me, even as I, maybe shirk my prep for the game that we're running day to day, as I start to look forward and how, I would like to see this campaign unravel post-Strahd. I keep thinking to myself, I really like the idea of there being multiple layers of challenges. I agree with you, Clayton. If let there be a vacuum of actual bad guy who's actually trying to do bad stuff to the world that needs to be stopped, then I feel like you run the risk of just being the world we live in, and me personally, I like to play role-playing games because it's an escape. And, in the real world, life's not very black and white. I recently had a conversation with my friend about game design and campaign writing, and he just I was kicking around some ideas, and he was like, I just want a bad guy. Sometimes I just get so tired of people running these games that, are meant to, you don't know if someone's good or if they're bad, and every character that you meet, you're suspicious of them. It's like, sometimes I just wish I could easily be able to peg who are the good guys so I can be a hero for them and then just go be a hero. And it doesn't have to be so opaque that there's this mystery element. Like, what's wrong with a game where you just know where's the bad guy? What's the right thing to do, and go do it, and go slay that person, or go try to, So I like having both. that kind of layer on top of each other. And maybe you don't even access the big bad, Maybe they never actually, the players choose to never involve themselves in that storyline. The world can still interact with them as a result of their lack of, interaction with an overall bad guy plot,
A villain isn't necessarily needed for a campaign to be good, but one thing you absolutely have to have is some sort of catalyst for change. And usually that is the villain. The villain is trying to change things in some way. They're trying to bring about the end of the world. They're trying to become the master of the world. They're trying to accomplish something that really throws the world into a tumultuous period. And very, very rarely is it the game where the world is at a status quo that the player characters should fight to maintain. The catalyst for change in the game can be good. It can be evil. Sometimes the player characters are the catalyst for the change. But in that instance, you've often got an opposition force that is trying to enforce some sort of oppression on people. And in others, you've got where the world is, in fantasy, very often the world is kind of idyllic and the villain is trying to bring evil into the world. So I see those as kind of like the two ends of a spectrum for what the world can be and why the player characters need to do something in the game. And very often a villain is the easiest way to convey that. Because I feel like in role-playing games, you don't have a lot of the benefits that you get from like books or movies or TV shows where those other media, they're able to show you kind of what's going on besides through the player character, besides the hero's perspective, besides the player character's perspective. In books and movies, you actually get scenes where the bad guys are doing things, and you get to know the bad guys through that, or you get to know whatever is causing the change in the world. But in a role-playing game, you basically have to do cutscenes if you want to share that information. And I just see having a villain that you can point to, or having an organization who is opposing the player characters. It's just an easy way to convey all of that information so that you don't have to go into the detail of pulling the story out of the player character's perspective and putting it into just the game master narrating a bunch of stuff that's happening.
Man, I used to play with this guy that ran Star Wars games all the time, and he would do that. After we would have some, run in with the Empire or whatever and, get out by the skin of our teeth, he would have some like post-encounter cutscene, just a couple minutes where he would just act out, this, Vader yelling at the Admiral or whatever. It was hilarious and awesome. That dude happened to be just really good at acting and doing voices and stuff like that. So it was engaging and like a really cool thing. I remember like multiple times during the fight thinking about like, what is he going to say after this if we do this, this, and that? And it was this weird interactive, kind of deal, that then turned into, not an info dump, but just sort of this meta, fourth wall breaking shot of what's going on. I loved it. It made the whole thing feel much more like, that pulp adventure kind of shit that you expect from Star Wars. So I've seen it done. It can happen. And we as players would learn stuff about the villains, but it was never like, actionable information. It was just conveying personality kinds of things and mood and stuff like that. And so that was that was interesting while playing the characters as well. So I'm not saying it, I just want to say that it's not that it can't be done. But it takes a certain kind of DM to pull it off for sure.
That's a really interesting idea. I've never encountered anything like that. Having some sort of mechanic or some sort of reason to let your players have a view into what the big bad, as they go along frustrating them, that there's a little interaction that maybe is a bit out of character, that they get to actually see the frustration or whatever the some of the consequences of them foiling a plot. I love that idea. But
it's hilarious, man. It felt so cinematic.
And I'm not going to take credit for this idea. This is something we haven't talked about yet, and I really want to because I'm looking at the handy dandy notes I was given. And the idea of the villain as an idea is interesting. I like that the idea could be that really the antagonist is a pervasive mindset. Say you place your characters, and I think in D&D this can come up quite often. This is something I think you guys have podcasted about it in the past, that if every time I run a D&D game, I know I always fall down a little bit in this area, but I really feel like it's difficult for a modern mindset to really engage in a world that's been inspired by the Middle Ages, say, or even older cultures that you draw upon to make your new world. And it's the more creative I feel like a DM gets about how their culture differs from a modern 21st century person's sensibilities, because we live in a capitalist consumer culture. And so D&D facilitates that by using a lot of coins, and we have an essentially, I know in Strahd and every other game I've ever ran, coins are the basis currency, and that's just easy. But, thinking about cultural norms that are more common, I'm reading a book that I'm going to give a shout out at the end of the session about, or at the end of this podcast about, that's about just how different life was in ancient times, how corporal punishment was the norm for children, how it, in medieval life and especially in the ancient Roman times, slavery was common. Serfdom allowed lords the right to physically abuse their underlings if they so choose. Wives were commonly, given corporal punishment by their husbands, just like children. It could just be that an interesting game would be to drop a 21st century person's mentality, a group of players that are going to be obviously horrified by that injustice, and just let them do as you like. An idea that comes to my mind is I remember I once ran a game where the economy of this small city was based around opium consumption and sale, and that was something that I had put in there just as a way for them to have some sort of economy. And so, of course, it also had, there were opium addicts in the city, and opium addiction was a problem in the world. But I didn't put it in there. It was really just kind of a small little sentence I wrote. And I remember, and Jordan, you played in this game, I don't know if you remembered it or not, but I had a player who was so offended by that being a fact. He completely disregarded any plot line I gave him until he removed the scourge of opium from this city. And it drove a lot of content. And for him, the villain in my story wasn't anything I had written to be the villains. It was the fact that this drug economy existed in a world where it was completely accepted the way I wrote it. It wasn't even controversial. But because he was a 21st century person who was a very faithful person in real life, he just couldn't put that out of character, But it created a lot of fun content.
I'm thinking now,
Do you recall that game? Do you remember it at all?
Vaguely. I think I know who you're talking about. This is a long time ago.
Oh yeah, it was 20 years at least.
Yeah. I don't know where I'd come down on stuff like that, because
well, I think you have to be very considerate of the fact you are playing with people with modern sensibilities. So if you get too real, it's going to really, keep people from having fun.
Right. What I was thinking was on the one hand, you can't change all of your enculturation, and this is like a total aside, but we can loop this back into villain stuff later, because this will have a lot to do with how the players as modern people assess what the villain is up to morally. But you can't get rid of all of our modern values out of your head or whatever, but you can also like kind of take that too far and like expect too much out of a setting. Like I think this problem is almost completely relegated to, you know, medieval fantasy and those sorts of things. But you know, as much as that could be a whole source of like side quest kinds of things, I could also see it derailing things. I have seen it derail things. It can get like super cringy sometimes, and like it, to some extent, I think that it's also very possible that it would just detract from the setting. Like part of it is, you know, this is not now, and there's lots of stuff that is here to demonstrate that it is not now, that it absolutely wouldn't fly in, you know, 21st century America, but that's part of why it's different. And just insisting on, you know, some human rights revolution or whatever, every fucking game turns into that, it seems like, if that snowball starts rolling. And it's like, fuck, man, are we doing this again? Are we having another, you know, orcs' rights fucking game or whatever the hell?
Right.
Like sometimes I get tired of the fucking, you know, let's start a movement D&D things, and it's like, this is the world we're in. This has always been what's told to us that is right and is, you know, divinely ordained or whatever the hell. Can we just play in the fucking setting as if we were born here and this is all we know, and not pull in some, you know, fucking neo-Marxist analysis?
What have your experiences been, Clayton, with parties picking up on aspects of your game or your world that you didn't necessarily intend to be something for them to wave the flag and get the protests going? But I mean, how do you deal with that whenever it comes up?
Just second, lots of thunder.
Oh, gotcha. Well, this brings me to something I've been dancing around. You know, I'm playing in another game now that I'm having so much fun in, but two things have been in the back of my head. That what happens when you are the villain? You know, we have, you know, everybody's played in the murder hobo game, and you know, I don't think too many murder hobos think they're murder hobos, but we have definitely crossed the line in this particular game where we tend to do the right thing by the worst possible method. And you know, it's occurred to me a few times. It's like, are we really the good guys in this story? And so the DM's been very generous, and you know, we are pursuing the greater good for sure. But you know, what do you do in those situations when the players maybe try vaguely to pursue your overall good storyline, but man, they're just doing things that in the world itself is reprehensible? You know, if you give them, say, you know, I mean, almost, I can't think of a society where stealing and murdering, you know, aren't just wrong and against the law. But if you've got a party who just seems to solve every problem by murdering and stealing, you know, how do you approach creating antagonists to them?
I just love the irony in the situation where the players are bringing 20th century values into some either historical or far future society, and they're using the most tyrannical methods to do so.
Oh, that's exactly what happened in my game. My very good, lawful good aligned character, who was just offended by the fact that the farmers adjacent to the town all grew opium. Well, his solution was to burn all their crops. You know? So, there goes
Did he work out a way to feed their kids?
Well, it plunged the economy of the town into a recession and caused some low-level starvation. If I can't remember, it's been a long time. I would like to think that if it was now, I would have made the players go through a whole, well, you've ruined their economy, what are you going to do about it? You know, I think I did, but I don't really recall. That's what I would do now.
The way I've handled it in the past is I've let the player characters like do these radical changes. But you know what happens whenever there is sudden radical change in the fundamental system of society? There is a large period of time where things are absolute shit, where there is starvation, where there are riots, where there is civil unrest, and the player characters have to deal with that. And I make it abundantly clear to them that all these bad things that are happening, this is because of your crusade. Don't ever forget that all of these people who are starving because you literally destroyed the economy. You're the reason why these kids are starving in the streets.
In the game that I'm playing now, that's kind of the tack that the DM's taking with us, because in his game, I'm a little ashamed to admit that I am the lawful good fighter that basically lops somebody's head off for being a bad dude, which is totally counterintuitive and contradictory. And I've admitted that to the DM too. And I've sought out some ways to maybe have to deal with that. I've offered to change my character's alignment to lawful evil and something along those lines. But, it's an easy thing to get involved in. And it's really a tightrope for the DM, because he's been gracious enough to keep us on the overall good story quest. But, we've ran into a few people who were tasked to deal with us as a result of our toppling a petty lord over this town that was my character's hometown. And yeah, sure enough, we plunged into chaos and he was replaced by somebody worse. And now we've got a bunch of mercenaries trailing us. And, every time we have to confront them, they're like, look, you did this. Thanks to you, this guy's dead. Thanks to you, the town is in chaos and now being ran by even worse people. So don't give me this good guy crap. And I'm like, you're right.
The Robespierre guy's on you.
Yeah, it's like, guilty, frowny face. Can I roll a new character? That's usually what I do.
Yeah, I always hate that cop-out of, the player characters, getting butthurt because of the consequences of their actions, because they didn't think things through. That's one thing that it irritates me every time I see it happen. And stereotypically, it is the situation where somebody decides, I'm going to literally bring 20th century ideals into turn of the millennium France, and it's just not going to work. And there are scholarly treatises on why there were communes and religious groups who were trying to do very egalitarian things back then, and every single time it just crashed and burned. And there are very deep analyses as to why they failed. But players don't want to hear about their plans failing. They don't want to hear about the reasons why things wouldn't work out the way they idealistically think that they should.
Yeah, I mean, we've gotten a bit pretty far afield from the villain thing, but that's why I think having, I definitely, though, ever since that game, when I sit down to write a game, I just resign myself to the fact that, it's asking a lot for the players to have been immersed in cultural norms and sociology classes and things of that nature, to be able to really have that perspective. At the end of the day, a lot of players are looking to be good guys, and their good guy mentality is set by modern standards. So I don't like to write modern day worlds that just happen to be dressed up in fantasy garb. But at the same time, whenever I do write these worlds and I'm thinking, this is a good place, this is what people would normally like, and then I put my 21st century hat on and I'm like, but my players are probably going to reject this because it's so far away from what they consider good and just. So I try to at least I do try to think ahead that this idea could be something that they could turn into their villain. And I have to be prepared for them to reject this and turn this into an object of what they want to change, and be prepared for the eventualities if they basically pick a villain I didn't choose, because that's always a possibility.
I'd love to see the players create the villain, like we were talking about, start out with a game where the world just sucks, and then they wind up befriending or being employed by or whatever, some like, Mao Zedong type of character. And they just fucking help that dude get to power, thinking, oh yeah, we're going to be egalitarian and it's going to be great, whatever. And then he starts up some camps. Before you know it, shit's going to hell. They thought that they were being victorious, but they were, leading the tyrant right to the throne.
That's a good example too.
Yeah, and I like using that where you do have a figurehead villain. The figurehead villain represents the ideas and ideals of a particular movement. But in that instance, yeah, if your player characters decide, you know what, we helped this guy get up here, but we realize how awful he is, we're just going to kill him. You know what? There are going to be plenty of true believers in that system that the player characters are now against an entire system that sees this as the way to go. This is the way to progress. This is the way to advance civilization.
Right. And, and that's kind of the tightrope we walk as DMs, isn't it? It's that, you can either satisfy your own creative urges and hope that it inspires your players to get really down into the nitty gritty of the world. I'm thinking kind of like Dragonlance here, I think Dragonlance did a really good job of how it started off as a regular sword and sorcery, low level campaign. And I think that was in prior to where they decided to pick up the books. Cause if I remember correctly, the first trilogy starts with them having had a layoff and they've been leveled. But then slowly as they progress down the storyline, the storyline was basically simple that, there was a big evil there's a big evil and the big evil's trying to corrupt the good world and you got to stop it. But they did that by developing relationships throughout the world and solving problems in the world that allowed them to rally. They overcame some political strife and broken down lines of communication between the people in the world, and that allowed them to muster. So it created this storyline. Yeah, it was black and white, but the actual nuts and bolts of it was to win these small, quests along the way that allowed them to be, essentially by the end of it, I think all the characters in Dragonlance eventually, were at the highest levels of society and they were big leaders and they eventually commanded the world itself because they had to get to that point in order to save the world and defeat the big bad. And I think that's, a way to take a black and white story, but still make it feel a little bit more nuanced than one dungeon after the other,
I've got a question for you guys. When you're running villains and you're thinking about, dealing with the party from the villain's perspective, it's a little schizophrenic because you simultaneously have the God view of the world of the DM, but then you also have to have, the limited in-character view of the villain in mind. And provided that, the villain's going to have some kind of information gathering resources, be it spies or scrying spells or probe droids or whatever it is, how do you guys think about fairly allocating information to your conception of your villain and letting that inform their actions against the party, and not metagaming from behind the DM screen? You know what I mean?
That's how I present the holes in the bad guy's plan. Is I'm privy to the player character sitting around the table and brainstorming about how they're going to be attacking the bad guy. And I may have thought of all of the things that the bad guy has going for them. But then when the player characters are doing their brainstorming, the player characters think of something that I never thought of. You know what? I may know that, but the villain never thought of that. So I try to incorporate it into the game that way. And I try not to have the bad guy or the big bad evil organization gain more knowledge than what I had originally set out that they would be privy to.
That is probably the most challenging aspect to running games I'm experiencing, definitely right now. But just kind of always have been, is that how do you preserve the mystery that compels the players to want to show up to the next session because they're afraid they're going to not be present for a big reveal or whatever, but also, let them know enough to actually figure out this puzzle because, really, most of the time, the bad guy's plan is essentially a puzzle that the players are unraveling. It's like, how do you divvy out the right amount of knowledge to the players so that they can effectively deal with the bad guy? But at the same time, if you give them the keys to the kingdom super early, then it's, if you don't have anything else, if you don't leave enough for, to reveal later on, I mean, to me, that creates a game that's very stale and boring. And then it's just, well, I guess we got to go get these 5 magic rocks spread around. Let's go. Okay, we got 5 dungeons, boys. Let's go,
Well, how do you deal, though, Eliot, with what information your villain has when they're hatching their plans against the party and all that? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean, it just depends on the villain because, I'm bad about starting my campaigns off at level 20. You know what I mean? The bad guy I have in mind is usually somewhat all-knowing, all-seeing, and all-able. And there are some obstacles in that particular, entity or human or whatever it may be. Because I usually play in fantasy worlds, and then from there, it's like I put constraints on the bad guy first. It's like, why can't, if this is a powerful creature, why isn't he just going out and doing it right now? So, and then at that point, it's just about, the players being able to foil those plans. So that's just how I look at it. As far as what the villains know, I'll be honest with you, I don't think of it much in terms of that. I just imagine that the players are peons that, especially at the beginning of the game, and the first thing is like, how are the players even going to get the attention of the bad guy? You know what I mean? Distinguish themselves, and that would be, well, by foiling this one thing. Then slowly over the course of any game, I think, your players should gain the attention of the bad guy. And then usually by that time, the game runs its course and people move on and you don't get to develop the second act. So that's why I'm putting a lot of effort into the campaign I'm running right now, because I have a lot of faith. I have a feeling that I'm at least going to get to play out the beginnings of a second out before life happens. And so I'm really taking it as an opportunity to be thinking about these ideas for the first time and get to implement them.
This transmission of knowledge between the player characters and the antagonist is something that I really like to play with as a dungeon master. Like, the way I design most campaigns is if there's a big bad, then the big bad has their plan, and the bad guy's plan exists until the player characters interact with it and fuck it up. I really believe in no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and in the bad guy's perspective, the player characters are the enemy, and the player characters are the ones who are introducing chaos into their plans. So once the player characters start interacting with the bad guy's plans, then I start playing with, okay, how do I transfer knowledge between the two of them? How does the bad guy learn about the player characters? How do the player characters learn about the bad guy? This might be the player characters either encountering minions, or maybe hearing stories about what the bad guy is doing, getting little pieces about what the bad guy or the evil organization are capable of doing, and hopefully learning a little bit about what their weaknesses might possibly be. And conversely, like, if there is a big bad and they send a group of soldiers after the player characters and the player characters kill them, there's often going to be usually there's not going to be a survivor of the bad guys who fought in that encounter, but there's often going to be some sort of a story that comes out from, like, particularly a fight that happened in public. There's going to be tales about the player characters that happen, like explaining what the player characters did. And the bad guy is going to hear those stories. And through those stories, the bad guy will learn, oh, now this player character has the ability to teleport 60 feet. gain little bits of information that way. And since that's an evolving thing for the player characters, as the player characters level up, they gain new abilities. I try to have the bad guy figure out a counter for the abilities that the player characters have demonstrated, but then leave gaps in the knowledge of the bad guy, of the main bad guy, for like new abilities that the player characters develop.
I think another way to think about this is, it's like you were saying about information. It's really writing a long run storyline where small players ascend to be able to take on big bads. There has to be an essential information asymmetry between the big bad and the characters. And really, I mean, I think a great example is probably Lord of the Rings, right? Sauron being all powerful, hugely, influential, but he doesn't know where the ring is, and the players do. And so, at that point, Sauron, it takes him quite some time to really grasp that his plans are fully in jeopardy because his ring is known and he doesn't realize to what extent. I'm sure he doesn't realize by the time they have the council that Elrond and all these, foes of his that are able, know this key weakness. And, would he have, I always wonder, should Sauron not have taken it a little more seriously that Strider was able to, take on all the ring wraiths early on in Fellowship? Shouldn't he have maybe marched an army there instead, just to secure the ring? But of course he didn't. But, I think that's kind of how I try to interact with my two villains in the party, is that, the villains have a plan that they're going to carry out regardless. And then the players get in the way because they have some information asymmetry, and how the players exploit that asymmetry really drives the game.
So we're starting to get a little bit long. I know I've got several more points I would like to talk about, but I don't think we've got enough time to get to them today. Are you guys fine with moving on to geek things?
Yeah.
Whatever you want to do, man.
All right. I've really only got one geek thing this week. It is a new show that is on HBO. There's only been one episode that's come out as of time of recording, but by the time this episode comes out, there will be a second episode. That is Lovecraft Country. The first episode came out last weekend, and the next episode comes out tomorrow as of recording, and I really can't wait for the next episode. Visually, it's very, very well done. I love in the first episode the dream that the main character has, where he's imagining a World War I scenario with all sorts of period appropriate sci-fi shit going on all around him. We get to finally see a more true to life rendition of Cthulhu, as he might appear in the real world, which I absolutely loved.
Yeah.
I'm really, really trying hard not to bring in a political slant at all, but just one thing that I really love about the concept of this show is, as those of us who are big fans of Lovecraft, one thing we all know that he might not have always been the most sensitive to race and things of that nature. And I love that a current master storyteller of our time, Jordan Peele, I believe he's behind this show, right? Or one of the major actors.
He's one of the executive producers, I want to say.
And I love the idea that someone who's being a really great storyteller, for that really puts minorities in the spotlight, that he's the one doing this story, because Lovecraft stories are classics, and I hope that they always remain so. I'll go ahead and go with mine. I had one, but I think I want to throw in another. The first is just a great book I'm reading right now. Clayton's also read it, which tickled me to death. It's called Life in a Medieval City by Francis Geese and Joseph Geese. I loved it so much. I've been chewing through it. It's all about what life is like in a medieval town in the 1300s. They wrote several books in the series about knights and castle life and city and village life. So I'm looking forward to reading through all those over the coming months. Secondly, over the weekend, I went to the movies for the first time in a long time, and I found out that in order for them to kind of get back on their feet, Cinemark is offering $100 private shows, and because not a whole lot of movies are out, they're going back and playing classics. So you can have up to 20 people in a show. So if you have, and when we showed up, we had almost everybody show up, and I mean, me and my wife sat in a row all to our own, and so I felt very safe and comfortable. And if you can get 20 people in your local area, it's $5 a piece at the most for if to rent out your own theater. You can watch Star Wars, you can watch Indiana Jones, you can watch The Goonies, you can watch. They have a whole huge list of classic movies that you can have a private show to. And it was just nice to be able to get back to a little bit of normalcy and still feel safe doing it. So I highly recommend supporting your local movie theater if you can.
So my thing, I guess, I just started watching Tales from the Loop on Amazon. I guess folks probably know it's based on the series of paintings that kind of blew up on the internet a couple of years ago by a Swedish artist, Simon Stålenhag, I guess you say it. But there's since been a role-playing game come out based on it as well, but the show's pretty good so far. We'll see where it goes. It gets high ratings, so I think I'm probably gonna enjoy it. But yeah, it's your typical 80s, like, kids on bikes in extraordinary circumstances, in a weird, like, what's the word I'm looking for?
I've seen trailers. It looks really cool.
Yeah, it's a lot of weird, like, anachronistic stuff mashed together. There's these kids in their 80s, like, Goonie kind of outfits running around, and then there's, like, bizarre high-tech shit around, robots and strange, like, physical phenomena happening, and it's an interesting mashup. It's just absolutely gorgeous, and it seems to be pretty well written. They're putting together some pretty compelling stories with a little more to go on than just some thought-provoking paintings as source material. So give it a look. I'd like to try out the role-playing game sometime, but yeah, that's my pick. Tales from the Loop.
All right, guys. What do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Let's do it.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.